The coffee that changed everything. Captain Marcus sat in the cockpit with his headset around his neck, his hands steady on the controls and his eyes fixed on the pre-flight checklist. But even as he worked through the steps, he could feel something wasn't right, the kind of feeling that crept into your chest and settled there like a quiet whisper you couldn't ignore. It was a routine morning flight from Atlanta to Chicago, the kind Marcus had flown more than 100 times before. The crew was mostly familiar faces, except one, the new flight attendant named Hannah, who had just joined their airline 3 months ago. She had introduced herself with a forced smile earlier at the gate, her tone polite, but strained, her eyes flicking away quickly when Marcus extended his hand for a greeting. She had hesitated for half a second too long before shaking it, and that half second told Marcus more than any words ever could. He had experienced that pause too many times in his career. It was the same look that told him someone didn't expect to see a black man in his position, not just a pilot, but the captain, the one in command, the one with the final say, the one responsible for hundreds of lives. And for some people that reality was still difficult to accept. As Marcus double-checked the fuel levels, he heard the cockpit door open behind him. Hannah's voice followed immediately. "Coffee, Captain," she said cheerfully, though again the cheer sounded thin, hollow, like it was stretched over something unpleasant. Marcus turned and reached for the cup, but the moment it touched his hand, he noticed it was unusually warm, but not in the comforting way. Something about it felt wrong. He brought it closer to his nose, and instantly the hairs on his neck stood up. There was a smell underneath the rich roast, something acidic and metallic, a sharp note that didn't belong in any beverage, let alone coffee. His eyes narrowed as he looked into the dark liquid, and that's when he saw it, a faint sheen floating near the top like oil catching the morning light and disappearing just as quickly. He didn't say a word, he didn't even move. Suddenly, Hannah's smile looked different, more nervous, more fixed. Marcus gave her a steady, unreadable look, then set the coffee down slowly on the console beside him, without breaking eye contact. First Officer Blake, sitting beside Marcus, had glanced at the cup, then at Hannah, but said nothing. He seemed uncertain, caught between instinct and discomfort. Marcus knew that hesitation well. "Are you okay, Captain?" Hannah asked, her voice lighter now, almost mocking. Marcus didn't respond. He calmly reached forward and pressed a coded button on the intercom, a security signal known only to cockpit and ground security personnel. Within moments, the flight marshal and 2 ground officers would be notified that something inside the aircraft was potentially dangerous and needed immediate attention. Without alerting the passengers, without creating panic, Hannah's face twitched, barely perceptible. But Marcus caught it. He'd been flying for 22 years, long enough to read faces like weather patterns, and hers said everything it needed to. He stood up, slowly stretched his back, and turned to face her directly, and said in a voice that was calm but carried an edge, sharp enough to cut steel, "You can leave the cockpit now, and do not touch anything else until security arrives." She opened her mouth to argue, but Marcus raised one hand gently and said, "Go." She turned and left the door shut behind her, and silence filled the space. Blake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Marcus sat down again and stared at the coffee, still untouched, the smell now more pungent than before, and in his gut he knew what had happened. This wasn't just a bad prank. This wasn't a joke. It was an assault, and worse, it was an insult carefully aimed at him, at who he was, and what he represented, a black man at the top of the command chain, in a world where many still didn't believe he belonged. There, the knock on the cockpit door came 5 minutes later. Security entered quietly and professionally. Marcus stood, pointed to the coffee, and calmly explained that he had reason to believe the contents had been tampered with. He then gestured toward Hannah, who stood with her arms folded outside the cockpit, stiff and pale, and said, "I want her removed from this flight, and I want that cup tested in front of witnesses now, please." One of the officers nodded and turned to Hannah, asking her to step forward. She refused at first, her voice rising as she insisted it was just a joke that he's blowing out of proportion, she said, her words sharp and defensive, her voice cracking. Under pressure, she added that she didn't mean anything by it, and accused Marcus of overreacting. Then, the moment that would later make headlines, she said the words that would haunt her career and brand her forever with a scar of disgrace. She said, "People like you always think everything's about race." Gasps came from behind as 2 other flight attendants, standing nearby, instinctively stepped back from her, their eyes wide, their mouths open. One of them, an older woman named Carol, who had flown with Marcus many times, looked horrified and quietly whispered something to the officers. The officers didn't hesitate after that. Hannah was restrained and escorted off the plane, kicking and screaming about how unfair this was, how she didn't do anything wrong, how the world was becoming too sensitive, all while passengers began filming on their phones. Some already uploading footage, others watching with shocked silence, as the woman who had minutes ago handed out coffee was now being dragged off the flight in handcuffs. Marcus didn't say a word through any of it. He sat in the cockpit, hands clasped, his mind racing. Not with anger, not even with hurt, but with something deeper, a quiet grief that came from years of being seen but not respected, trusted but not believed, promoted but never truly accepted. He had endured comments behind his back, promotions delayed with vague excuses, flight assignments mysteriously switched to less visible routes, and subtle but persistent reminders that no matter how clean his record, how perfect his performance, some people would always see his skin before his stripes. What stung most wasn't the coffee or the insult, it was that when he looked at Blake, the young white co-pilot beside him, he saw hesitation, fear, maybe even complicity. Blake still hadn't spoken, still hadn't stood up or said anything in his defense, and that silence felt louder than Hannah's screams. Ground security cleared the area, removed the cup carefully, and promised a full forensic test within the hour. Passengers were reseated with apologies. The replacement attendant was called in, and Marcus prepared for takeoff. But something had changed. He wasn't the same man who walked onto that plane an hour ago. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was now a symbol, a story, a headline waiting to happen, but not for the reason people thought. The real story wasn't just that. Hannah spat in his coffee. The real story was what came after, because in the hours that followed, something strange happened. Flight attendants, past and present, began reaching out to him anonymously through text, through email. Some even left voicemails telling him about what they had seen, what they had overheard, how complaints had been buried, how certain crew members had joked openly about certain captains and their place on the flight deck, how the company had quietly moved people around rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Marcus sat alone in his hotel room that night after landing and listened to the voicemails one by one, as if piecing together a broken mirror. With every word, with every story, the picture became clearer. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just one racist flight attendant. This was something built into the wallpaper of the company, something no one wanted to talk about. But now the silence was cracking, and Marcus was at the center of it, not because he asked to be, but because he no longer had a choice. Next morning his phone rang. It was a journalist from a national outlet. She had somehow gotten wind of what had happened. Someone on the flight must have leaked the footage. She said she wanted his side of the story before the airline put out their own version, before the spin started, before the narrative was controlled. Marcus didn't answer right away. He stared at the phone, his reflection in the screen, his face tired but strong. He knew if he spoke, the storm would begin. If he stayed silent, it would die down, and maybe the company would handle it quietly. Maybe Hannah would be fired and things would go back to normal. But he also knew normal wasn't good enough anymore. Not when normal meant swallowing the insult, smiling through the sting, pretending it didn't happen. He picked up the phone and said 2 words. "I'm ready." The whisper turns into a roar. Marcus stood at the edge of the hotel balcony, the early morning wind brushing against his face as planes carved white trails through the blue sky above. He had barely slept the night before, not because of fear, but because his mind wouldn't stop spinning, memory after memory, voice after voice, voicemail after voicemail, as though a dam had cracked, and a flood of silent truths was rushing toward him and refusing to stop. He held his phone in his hand, still lit up from the last message he had listened to. It was a flight attendant who had worked with Hannah before, saying she had heard the woman make disgusting remarks about black passengers, and especially about Marcus, saying it was only a matter of time before someone taught him a lesson. That message chilled Marcus in a way nothing else had. So far he wasn't just a victim of casual racism. Now this was coordinated, something premeditated and deliberate. And it wasn't just about the coffee anymore. It was about a sickness in the system, a sickness that had festered so long it had begun to rot the bones of the airline he had served with pride for over 2 decades. By the time the sun was fully up, Marcus had made his decision. He picked up the phone again, but not to call the airline, not to call a lawyer, not even to call the journalist who had left 3 more messages overnight. Instead, he called his niece, Ava, who worked as a digital forensics analyst for a private security firm. Ava was young, sharp, and fiercely protective of her uncle. Since she was a child, she had looked up to him, as the hero who had broken every ceiling placed above his head. When Marcus told her what had happened, there was silence on the line. Not shocked silence, but the kind that meant her mind was already racing, working, calculating. Send me everything, she said, every message, every email, every recording, and let me dig. I want to see what's under the surface. Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him, and for the first time in hours, he felt like he wasn't carrying this burden alone anymore. Within minutes he began forwarding the messages from crew members, former employees, and even 2 pilots, who had remained silent for years out of fear of losing their careers. One message in particular stood out. It was from a woman named Rachel, who had worked in the HR department for the airline over 5 years ago. She claimed she had seen at least 4 official complaints submitted against Hannah, and none had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Instead, Rachel said the complaints were marked as resolved without the complainants ever receiving a follow-up. Marcus forwarded that message to Ava with a note that said, "This is bigger than I thought." Ava responded in seconds, "I'm going to need a few hours. Stay by your phone while Ava worked." Marcus returned to the airport, not as a captain, not in uniform, but in plain clothes, sunglasses on, head down, moving through terminals like a passenger. He had received a call from the airline asking him to meet privately with internal affairs, and to corporate lawyers they said they wanted to clear up the incident before the media turned it into something bigger. Marcus knew what that meant. They wanted silence, they wanted compliance, they wanted him to nod, smile, and let it disappear beneath a fresh PR statement. He sat in the meeting room, his back straight, his hands folded in front of him, and listened as the corporate voices danced around phrases like unfortunate misunderstanding and regrettable incident, and we would like to move forward together as a team. The lead investigator, a woman named Linda, tried to assure Marcus that Hannah had already been placed on leave, and that the matter was being handled internally, but her eyes never met his, not once. Then they offered him a settlement, a sizable one, a check with enough zeros to make most people stop thinking about justice and start thinking about peace. But Marcus didn't move. He didn't even glance at the paper. He simply asked, "Can I record this conversation for my personal records?" The room went still, and after a long pause, Linda said that wouldn't be necessary. That told him everything he needed to know. Marcus stood up, pushed the check back across the table, and said, "I'll be giving my statement to the media and to federal authorities. You've had years to do the right thing. Now you'll have to explain why you didn't." He left the room without waiting for a reply. Outside the terminal, his phone rang again. It was Ava, her voice buzzing with energy and urgency. She had found something buried in a shared company server, accessible only to high-level HR staff. She had discovered a hidden folder marked confidential. Internal concern tracking. Inside were dozens of red-flagged incidents involving flight crew misconduct, passenger discrimination, and even pilot harassment. Almost all of them were marked as resolved or dismissed, many involving black and minority employees. Marcus's name appeared 3 times, all linked to past complaints he never even knew had been filed on his behalf. Once, when a co-pilot made a joke about affirmative action, once when a passenger demanded a different pilot, and once when Hannah herself had tried to switch crews just days before the coffee incident. Citing discomfort working with Marcus, though no action had been taken, she was still cleared for his flight. Ava said the files had timestamps, digital signatures, and internal communications, proving someone in the company had been actively scrubbing records to avoid escalation. This wasn't just a bad apple. This was systemic. This was cover-up level corruption. Marcus felt a wave of fury rise in his chest, not just because of what had been done to him, but because of the people who had tried to speak up before him, and were silenced, pushed out, discredited, paid off, and forgotten. He asked Ava if the files could be backed up and submitted to the press. Ava said, "Already done. I sent copies to 3 journalists and to civil rights watchdog groups anonymously with metadata intact. They can't bury this anymore." The next day, Marcus sat in front of a national news anchor in a live studio interview. The footage of Hannah's arrest had already gone viral, but now Marcus was putting a face to the story, and more importantly, the truth. He told everything, not with rage, not with tears, but with quiet, unwavering truth. The audience leaned in. The network's phone lines exploded. Social media lit up with support. Hashtags trended within hours. Justice for Coptercass, Voices for Aviators, and Fly with Honor were just a few that emerged and spread like wildfire across platforms. The airline issued a statement later that evening saying they were shocked by the findings and launching an independent investigation, but the damage was already done. Sponsors began pulling out major news. Outlets began digging deeper, former employees started speaking on camera, and within 72 hours, a congressional subcommittee requested internal records from the airline for possible federal review. Through it all, Marcus remained calm, not because it didn't affect him, but because he'd already made peace with his path. He was no longer just a pilot, he was a witness, a catalyst, a man standing at the center of a long overdue reckoning, and in every interview, in every article, in every stage, he repeated one message: this isn't about revenge, this is about truth, this is about safety, this is about the future for every kid who dreams of flying, and deserves to be judged by their skill, not their skin. And, far away in a quiet room, Hannah sat watching the screen, her face pale, her name now erased from the company website, her future uncertain, her actions no longer hidden behind company protection. And for the first time in her life, she understood that there were consequences not just for the hate she carried, but for the system that had allowed it to grow unchecked. But the story was far from over, because what came next would test Marcus in ways he never expected, and bring forward someone from his past who had remained silent too long, the man in the shadows. City lights sparkled across the skyline like a field of broken stars, and Marcus stood in the hotel suite, gazing down at the streets far below. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, but his thoughts were louder, sharper. Each headline that flashed across the screen seemed more surreal than the last: airline executive placed on leave, HR director resigns. Under pressure, whistleblower statements, confirmed audio recordings leaked. And through all of it, Marcus remained composed, not because he wasn't shaken, but because he had learned long ago how to bury shock beneath steel. Resolve. The truth was out now, and the world was watching, but Marcus knew the deeper sickness hadn't yet surfaced. He could feel it in his bones, that this went higher than anyone dared admit them. His phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The text said, only one line: I know what happened in 2011, meet me at the airport cafe tomorrow, noon, come alone, and don't tell anyone. Marcus stared at the message, his heart skipping once. He didn't need to ask what it meant. He knew 2011 better than most. He had buried it for years, tucked it away behind silence and professionalism, and the unspoken code of survival that so many black professionals carried with them every single day. The next day, he arrived early, dressed in plain clothes again. He sat at the corner of the cafe near the window, sunlight streaming over the table, and waited. 15 minutes passed before the man appeared, tall, with silver hair and a slight limp. His suit was well cut but old, his face lined with time and quiet pain. Marcus recognized him instantly. Harold Evans, former chief flight instructor for the airline, the man who had trained dozens of captains, including Marcus himself, years ago. Harold had disappeared from the company under strange circumstances. Rumors had swirled, but no one knew the truth until now. Harold sat down without a word, pulled a small envelope from his jacket, and placed it on the table. He looked older than Marcus remembered, but his eyes still carried the same fierce intelligence. Marcus waited as Harold sipped his coffee, then finally spoke in a voice low and rough. They erased everything. Marcus, the files, the recordings, the complaints, all of it. They made it look like nothing ever happened, but I couldn't forget, and when I saw you on the news, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Marcus felt the room shift. The quiet of the cafe now felt like a stage, a moment frozen in time. Harold continued, you remember that co-pilot in 2011, the one who refused to fly with you? After the Denver storm, he filed a false report, said you jeopardized the aircraft, but I was in the simulator with you. I reviewed the black box. I knew he lied. I wrote a report clearing you, but they buried it. They told me to rewrite it, said it would protect the company's image, said there was no room for controversy. Right before our merger with the European firm, and when I refused, they forced me out, offered me a payout and a silence agreement, but I never signed it. I kept everything. He pushed the envelope closer, and Marcus slowly opened it. Inside were printed emails, copies of his cleared report, internal memos instructing legal to suppress it, and even an anonymous letter from a junior staffer expressing concern over racial bias in pilot evaluations. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he turned each page, his memory crashing back to that year when his career had nearly derailed over something he couldn't explain, when no one stood up for him, not publicly, not even Harold. And now here it was, the truth in his hands. 13 years later, wanted to say something back then. Harold said, but my wife had cancer, my son was starting college, and I was scared they'd blacklist me. I told myself someone else would speak up. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Marcus looked up and met his gaze silently, nodding not with anger but with something deeper understanding, because he knew that kind of fear too. He had lived with it for years, swallowed it day after day, dressed it up in professionalism and perfection. They both sat in silence for a long moment before Marcus asked, "Why now?" Harold sighed. "Because I watched that video of you not even flinching when she spat in your coffee, and I realized you were still standing straight, still carrying weight that should have broken you, and I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore." That evening, Marcus shared the documents with Ava, who immediately scanned and encrypted everything before sending it to her journalist contact. The reporter called back in under 5 minutes, her voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. "This proves obstruction of justice. It proves malicious suppression. This changes everything," she said. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he looked out the hotel window again, but this time not at the street below. This time he was thinking about the co-pilot from 2011. The one who had almost ended his career, the one who had never faced consequences, the one still flying international routes under the same airline. The next day that co-pilot's name hit the press, and within hours, 3 former colleagues came forward confirming that he had a pattern of refusing to fly with minority captains. One of them even revealed that he had once altered a flight log to shift blame after an incident over Miami, but no one had questioned him because he came from a legacy family whose father and uncle both held executive seats on the airline board. The story exploded, and suddenly it wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about all the people the system had failed, all the voices drowned beneath bureaucracy and silence. The airlines scrambled to contain the fallout, announcing a full audit, hiring an external equity team, placing 6 senior staff members on suspension, and even launching a hotline for employee misconduct. But the public wasn't satisfied, neither were the pilots, nor the flight crews, nor the countless employees past and present who now felt something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Marcus kept receiving messages from strangers, from janitors, from ground staff, from people who said they had once dreamed of rising through the ranks, but gave up because they saw what happened to people like him, and now they were inspired to try again because of him, because he didn't sit down, because he didn't settle, because he stood and faced the fire and made the world watch. But not everyone was celebrating, because behind closed doors, in a quiet boardroom in the company's headquarters, a different conversation was taking place, one that involved insurance liabilities, reputation management, and a simple chilling question: if Marcus keeps digging, what else will he find? And at the center of that question sat a man no one had seen in public in years, the chairman of the board, the one who had overseen the hiring of the executive who buried Marcus's record, the one who had personally signed off on Hannah's final transfer approval, the one who had ghostwritten the apology statement sent to the press, the one who Marcus was about to meet face to face for the first time in over a decade, because while the world was just now waking up to the truth, Marcus had just discovered the final piece of the puzzle. And it wasn't about the coffee or the flight, or even 2011, it was about what happened during the captain selection in 2008, a year when Marcus should have been promoted and wasn't, and the reason why had just surfaced in an old email uncovered by Ava, buried deep in a server backup saved under a false name. The email contained one sentence, and that sentence changed everything. "He's good, but let's keep the optics clean for now. We'll give him smaller routes until the spotlight fades." The email was signed by the chairman himself. Marcus sat in his room staring at the message, his jaw tight, his chest heavy. He knew now what had been stolen, not just from him, but from countless others, and he knew that this fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The meeting that shook the sky. The boardroom was quiet, too quiet, like the stillness before a storm. The long polished table stretched between Marcus and the man who had once shaped the fate of the entire airline industry, and who now sat across from him, hands folded, expression unreadable. The chairman's name was Daniel Price, a man whose face rarely appeared in public, whose decisions had influenced thousands of careers behind closed doors, and who now, for the first time in 15 years, was about to speak directly to the man whose future he once controlled. Without ever meeting his eyes, Marcus sat without blinking, his back straight, his silence louder than any accusation. He had already lived through the storm, he had already buried enough pain for 10 lifetimes, and now all that was left was the truth, raw and uncovered. Price cleared his throat, leaned forward and said, "I assume you've seen the email then?" Marcus nodded slowly, and pulled the printed message from his jacket, sliding it across the table toward the man who signed it. Without a moment of hesitation, you said, "I was good, but that you needed to keep the optics clean." "What does that mean exactly?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Price stared at the words on the page, like they belonged to someone else, like time might erase their meaning. If he looked long enough, then finally he looked up and said what all cowards say when they're caught. "I did what I thought was best for the company back then. We were under pressure, we were negotiating international partnerships, and the biscuit European market was sensitive. We needed a certain image, someone who would reassure investors, someone who looked familiar to them, someone who didn't raise questions or tension or headlines." "You mean someone white?" Marcus said, his voice calm but steady. "Someone who looked like your son, your brother, your reflection in the mirror." Price didn't reply, but his silence said enough. Marcus stood, slowly walked to the window that overlooked the runway, and watched as a plane lifted off into the sky, carving a path through the clouds. He thought of how many years he had flown with a perfect record, never once making a mistake, never once failing a test, never once receiving the recognition or rank he had earned, and all because of one sentence, one choice, one lie disguised as strategy. "Could have said something," Marcus said. "You could have changed it at any point, but you let it happen again and again, and you covered it up each time with prettier language, with phrases like not the right time, or needs more experience, or doesn't quite fit the culture. You watched people like me rise just enough to give the illusion of fairness, then pushed us back down when no one was looking." Price stood slowly and walked toward Marcus, trying to meet his gaze, trying to sound reasonable. "We were playing a long game, Marcus. This wasn't about race, it was about timing and diplomacy. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices for the greater good, and I made those decisions for everyone, not just for you." But Marcus turned to face him and said, "The greater good doesn't require people to vanish, doesn't require lies, doesn't require someone to spit in my coffee and get away with it until a video goes viral. You sacrificed integrity for comfort, for image, for legacy, and now you're going to answer for it." Price moved to sit again, but Marcus didn't. He remained standing and placed another folder on the table, this one compiled by Ava with names, dates, emails, and testimonies, not just about Hannah or the co-pilot from 2011, but about 3 other captains who were quietly demoted after promotions, were blocked by executives tied to Price's office, about 2 engineers who were fired after raising discrimination concerns, and about a passenger complaint that was never investigated because the victim didn't have the right last name. Opened the folder, slowly turning the pages one by one as he spoke, each story, each voice, each wound. Price's face began to tighten, his fingers clenching slightly at the table edge, and when Marcus finally closed the folder, he said, "I'm not here for money, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for acknowledgement, for real change, for every person whose dream you diluted with your silence." Price said, "What do you want then? Tell me what you're here to do." And Marcus answered, "I want your resignation. I want you to publicly admit what happened, and I want your board to restructure policies so that what you buried never happens again. I want flight evaluations audited. I want whistleblowers protected. I want every complaint re-reviewed under oversight, and I want Hannah's incident used in your new training program so no one forgets what was allowed to happen." Price stared at him and said, "Do you realize the damage this will cause to the company, to the brand, to your own career?" And Marcus said, "The damage was already done when you decided that my skin color was too loud for investors. When you decided that my silence was easier to manage than my voice. The only difference now is that people are finally listening." The door opened and 2 legal observers stepped in, representing the Civil Aviation Committee. Marcus had invited them quietly without notice, and now they stood behind him, ready to document every word. The meeting became official, and Price knew it. He sat down, slowly, deflated, cornered, exposed, his legacy no longer untouchable, his empire no longer immune. The next day, headlines shifted again. Airline chairman resigns in wake of scandal. Pilot speaks truth in historic meeting. Policy overhaul promised across aviation industry. And Marcus stood before reporters reading a statement, not of anger but of responsibility. "Today is not about me, it's about a broken system being held accountable. Today we take the first step toward rebuilding trust, not with words but with actions, and this is only the beginning." Over the next few weeks, a new wave of audits swept the airline. New diversity leadership was installed, training materials were rewritten, and dozens of suspended complaints were reinvestigated. Many of them confirmed what Marcus had said all along, and for the first time, Employees began speaking freely, knowing someone was finally listening, but not everything was fixed overnight. Marcus knew that real change takes time, that one scandal, no matter how loud, couldn't undo decades of quiet betrayal. He continued to fly, not for recognition, but because he still loved the sky, still loved the quiet hum of the engine, the calm before takeoff, the moment wheels left the ground, and gravity gave way to freedom. One morning, a little boy with dark skin and wide eyes approached him in the terminal holding a toy airplane, his mother smiling shyly behind him. The boy said, "Are you a real pilot?" And Marcus knelt, smiled and said, "Yes, I am, and maybe one day you will be too." The boy beamed, and Marcus felt something lift from his chest. Not everything could be measured in statements or headlines. Sometimes change looked like hope in a child's eyes, and somewhere in a quiet apartment Hannah sat alone, her phone dark, her name scrubbed from airline records, her silence now echoing louder than her laughter ever did. She watched as Marcus rose, not just above her actions, but above the entire weight of the system that protected her, and for the first time she understood what it meant to be grounded not by policy but by truth. But Marcus wasn't done, not yet, because someone else had just come forward. Someone from outside the airline, someone from the government, someone who claimed this wasn't just about corporate bias, but federal neglect, someone who said files were hidden from regulators, someone who said the rabbit hole went deeper than anyone had yet seen, and now Marcus was holding the key to it, the files that should never exist. The call came just after midnight, a number Marcus did not recognize, no caller ID, only silence on the other end, until a voicemail, calm and steady, said, "I know what you exposed, but I also know what you missed, and if you want to see it with your own eyes, come to the Federal Archives room, B17 tomorrow morning, ask for Director Martin, and bring no one else, not the press, not the lawyers, not even your NIS." Marcus stared at the phone, unsure if he was hearing a threat or an invitation. Part of him hesitated, part of him wanted to forget the voice, move on, enjoy the justice he had already fought for. But the stronger part of him, the part that carried years of buried truth and stubborn endurance, knew this wasn't over, knew there was more, and he needed to see it at 9 the next morning. Marcus arrived at the government complex, walking past layers of marble columns and silent security guards. The receptionist checked a list, then handed him a small visitor badge and motioned toward the elevator. "4th floor, 3rd door, to the left." She said no expression on her face, as if she had done this before, as if she knew what he was about to learn inside. Room B17. The air was cold, and still the lights dimmed the room, filled with long rows of steel filing cabinets and sealed boxes, and sitting in the middle of it all, behind a plain metal desk, was Director Martin, tall, pale, in a dark gray suit, his face unreadable, until he stood and offered his hand. "Mr. Marcus, it's an honor to meet you. I've been following your story closely, and what you've done is admirable, but what you've uncovered is only the surface of a larger issue, one that involves not just your airline but several others, and more importantly, the department responsible for overseeing aviation safety and ethics." Marcus did not speak. He only nodded, waiting for what came next. Martin gestured toward a sealed drawer and entered a keycode, opening it slowly before pulling out a thick folder marked with an old federal clearance code. The front read Internal Complaint Records, Class B Suppressed Cases, 2007 to 2019, and as he opened it, Marcus saw pages upon pages of reports submitted by pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew across multiple airlines, all describing incidents of racial targeting, discrimination, falsified flight evaluations, and retaliation for speaking out. Many of the names were Black or Latino, some were Asian, a few indigenous, all carried the same pattern: buried, filed, never investigated. Martin said quietly, for over a decade, certain complaints flagged as reputational risks were quietly funneled away from public review, sealed internally and marked as resolved before federal investigators could access them. This wasn't a glitch. This was policy crafted behind closed doors, with the support of high-level executives, and sadly, even a few within our own agency. We were told to protect the industry image, to maintain investor trust, especially during the international expansion phases and merger negotiations that shaped today's aviation landscape. Marcus felt like the air had thickened in the room, each page a stone pressing down on his chest. He saw familiar names, not just his own, but others he had trained with, others who had vanished from the flight roster without warning, others who had whispered warnings to him over the years, and now here they were written in ink, buried by bureaucracy and lies. "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus asked, his voice low, not from fear but from the weight of everything rising inside him. Because Martin said, the tide is turning and we need someone visible, someone credible, someone who has already risked everything to make truth public. We need someone to testify before the Federal Oversight Committee. When these files are declassified in 3 weeks, and you, Marcus, are the only name on every list who still wears the wings, who still stands tall, and who cannot be silenced. Marcus sat in the quiet for a long moment, then reached for the folder, flipping through each report until he found a single sheet paper, yellowed edges, typewritten, filed in 2008. It was a report from a junior mechanic, describing an incident where a pilot deliberately damaged a brake valve, then blamed it on the black maintenance team. The mechanic had submitted a formal complaint, but was fired within the month, and the pilot was promoted weeks later. That mechanic had been Marcus's cousin, Samuel. Marcus closed the folder and said, I'll do it, but if I speak they need to hear everything, not just about planes or pilots, but about how a system this big chose silence over safety, how careers were ruined, how families were broken, how a man like my cousin ended up driving taxis after being called a liar by the same people he worked to protect. Martin nodded and said, you'll have your chance that night. Marcus sat alone in his apartment, lights off, city below him, a river of red and white lights flowing through darkness. He held the folder in his lap, the pages inside, heavy with truth and pain and sacrifice, and he knew once this went public his life would never return to what it was. People would call him a hero, others would call him a traitor to the industry he loved. Some would try to smear him, others would try to use his voice for their own agendas, but through all of it he would remain the same. Grounded, focused, determined. Ava called just after midnight. She had already heard through encrypted channels what was happening. She told him she had his back no matter what, and that she would be in the hearing room with him, even if she had to stand in the hallway. Marcus smiled, not because it made things easier, but because it reminded him that even in darkness there was light. 3 days later, a journalist released a preview of the declassified records, naming Marcos as the lead witness, and civil rights groups began organizing public support online. People across the country shared stories of aviation bias, their fathers denied jobs, their mothers mistreated in training programs, their siblings fired without reason, and the hashtag Marcus will testified trended globally. But the pushback came to emails, threats, private investigators showing up at Ava's office, strange men following Marcus to his car, subtle warnings in the press editorials, questioning his motives, his sanity, his loyalty. But he didn't bend, he didn't break. He simply kept walking forward. And, just as everything seemed too quiet, a knock came on his apartment door. Marcus opened it and found a woman standing there, older, dressed in a faded flight uniform, holding a picture frame. She introduced herself as Carol, the senior flight attendant who once flew with Marcus, and who had witnessed what Hannah did that day. But what Marcus didn't know was that Carol had kept her own secret, a recording from 3 years ago, where 2 executives discussed Marcus's name in a meeting, laughing, joking about how they'd keep him out of any high-profile assignments for another year, just long enough for the European merger to go through. Carol had kept it hidden, afraid of losing her pension, but after watching what Marcus was doing, she couldn't stay quiet anymore. Took the flash drive and thanked her, and once again, another crack formed in the wall of silence surrounding the industry, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt not just the weight of the truth, but the power of it, the power to reshape something old and broken into something worthy of the dreams it once promised. And yet, even as he prepared for the federal testimony, there was one more message, one final file Ava hadn't opened yet, one that contained the name of the person who had created the original suppress and seal protocol in the agency, the man behind the system that had buried them all for years. And the moment Marcus saw the name, everything around him stopped, because the man was not Daniel Price, and he was not a faceless bureaucrat. Was Marcus's former mentor, the man who once told him he would make history, the man who had sponsored his early promotions, the man who had stood beside him at the captain's badge ceremony. And now that man was the final gatekeeper of the truth, the testimony that changed everything. The hearing room was full to the walls. Cameras lined the back, news anchors whispered into their mics, the air buzzed with the weight of expectation. People from across the country tuned in, watching the man who had once been just a name on a flight schedule, now standing before a federal committee, his uniform pressed, his voice steady, his eyes carrying the stories of thousands. Marcus stood, not as a victim but as a vessel, carrying every suppressed voice, every buried truth, every name erased for the sake of corporate image. And when he spoke, the room fell silent. Did not begin with Hannah, or the coffee, or even the email from the chairman. He began with a boy who once dreamed of touching the sky, who studied harder than anyone, who flew with excellence, who was told he had to be twice as good to be seen as equal, and who learned to wear silence like armor. He told them that boy was him, but also so many others, and that the time for armor was over. He told the truth about the evaluations that were doctored, the promotions that were delayed, the files that were buried, the voices that were erased. He named names, he cited dates. He handed over documents one by one, not with vengeance but with precision. He told them how his cousin Samuel had been labeled a liability after reporting sabotage, how Ava had traced a network of hidden databases, how Director Martin had confirmed federal complicity. And when the room shifted with murmurs and rising tension, he raised his hand and said firmly, "I am not here to destroy, I am here to rebuild, because no industry, no system, no sky should carry weight soaked in silence, and no one should have to fly with fear in their veins." Then they asked him about the final name, the one at the root of the suppression protocol, the one that shocked even him, and Marcus paused, his throat tightening, his heartbeat a drum inside his chest. The committee chair said softly, "Is it true that your mentor authorized the creation of the policy that buried your first clearance report and blocked your early print?" Nodded slowly, and then he told the story of that man, a captain revered, a legend in aviation circles, a mentor who had once told Marcus, "You will fly higher than anyone before you," but who behind closed doors feared the attention Marcus brought, feared the change he represented, and so had created a shadow policy to silence the rising voices before they reached the light. He looked into the cameras and said, "I forgive the man, but I do not excuse him, because forgiveness is for healing, but truth is for justice, and justice must be seen, not whispered behind doors or typed in sealed memos, but spoken aloud before the world, and held accountable by it." When he stepped down from the podium, the room erupted, not in applause but in tears, in nods, in quiet resolve, because the truth had landed, and once truth lands, it cannot be ignored over. The following week's arrests were made, resignations handed in, new protocols signed into law, whistleblower protections, expanded training programs rewritten, aviation schools restructured with oversight, and at the center of it, Marcus stood, not for glory but for every pilot who had flown unseen, every flight attendant who had swallowed rage, every engineer who had been overlooked, every child who now looked to the sky and believed. Geneva received a federal appointment to oversee digital transparency. In transportation, Director Martin was placed in charge of the full internal review committee. The name of Marcus's cousin Samuel was cleared posthumously, and his family received public apology and compensation from the Department of Aviation. And Marcus continued to fly, not because he had to, but because the sky still called him. And now when he walked into terminals, children pointed, not with surprise but with pride. Mothers whispered, "That's him." Fathers stood straighter, and one day an old man approached with tears in his eyes and said, "Because of you, my son stayed in flight school." And Marcus simply smiled and said, "Then it was all worth." I visited the grave of his cousin, placed his captain pin on the stone, and whispered, "They finally heard you." And when he walked away, the wind carried his words like a promise across the open air. In a world that once tried to ground him, Marcus soared, not because he was allowed to, but because he had earned it, and now no one could ever take that away again. The end.